His voice carried that practiced boredom, the tone of someone who'd played this game 100 times before and always won. Somewhere in the scattered crowd behind him, laughter erupted, not the innocent kind, but the knowing kind. The kind that said everyone here understood exactly how this would end. She felt the cold concrete column pressing into her spine, rigid and unforgiving. The entire cafeteria reeked of industrial cleaning solution mixed with the greasy smell of institutional pizza. Overhead, fluorescent tubes buzzed their monotonous hum while plastic trays clattered against metal rails. Voices blended into an indistinct roar that suddenly felt miles away despite the dozens of witnesses surrounding her. "Don't," she managed to say. The word emerged smaller than she intended. Not because fear had stolen her voice, but because shock had squeezed the air from her lungs. Her hands hung at her sides, fingers opening and closing reflexively as her mind struggled to process what was happening in broad daylight, in front of all these people who refused to see. He moved closer, that distinctive maroon varsity jacket stark against the institutional beige walls. The white leather sleeves caught the harsh overhead lighting. The bold H emblazoned across the chest seemed to announce his untouchability. His expression carried that easy confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. He wasn't rushing. That detail chilled her more than anything else, the casual way he treated this moment, like he had all the time in the world. "Come on, it's just a joke," he said, his grin widening. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears so loudly she wondered if others could hear it. Instinctively, she scanned the room, searching desperately for eye contact, for someone who might see her fear and choose to act. Most people looked away immediately. Some stared openly, feeding off the spectacle. A handful smirked, enjoying the entertainment without accepting any responsibility. Why for it? Then, at the very edge of her peripheral vision, a chair scraped against the floor. The sound was subtle, easily missed beneath the cafeteria din. Neither he nor she registered it fully. But something fundamental had shifted in the room's atmosphere, and once that shift occurred, there would be no returning to how things were before. Chapter 1, First Impressions. The first thing that struck her about the cafeteria wasn't the students. It was the sound, an endless echo of conversations bouncing off tile floors and glass windows, underscored by the mechanical drone of lights that never fully dimmed. This was the kind of space where privacy died, where every action felt exposed even during moments of absolute normalcy. On her first day at this school, she'd told herself the exposure was acceptable. Visibility created opportunities, didn't it? She'd positioned herself near the support column because it provided something solid at her back. Years of training had instilled that habit: always be aware of your surroundings, exits, blind spots, potential threats. Even now, dressed in her workout gear and camouflage cargo pants, her posture radiated alertness without aggression. Shoulders squared, feet planted with purpose, anyone truly looking would have recognized the discipline in how she carried herself. But most people never looked that closely. They saw surface details and filled in narratives based on assumption rather than observation. The new girl. Mid-semester transfer. Whispers followed her through hallways. Nobody asked direct questions about why she'd arrived when she did. Instead, they crafted their own stories. Some assumed she'd caused trouble at her previous school. Others decided she must be running from something. Nearly everyone believed she wouldn't last long here. She grabbed a tray from the stack, nodded politely to the cafeteria worker manning the register, and surveyed the room for an empty seat. The tables formed distinct clusters, social boundaries drawn and enforced without words. Athletes claimed one section, honors students another, a particularly loud group dominated the corner. She spotted an available chair near the center aisle and moved toward it, keeping her gaze forward, breathing measured and steady. That's when she felt it. Not physical contact yet, but the unmistakable shift in atmosphere. The way air pressure changes when someone violates your personal space without permission. "Hey!" The voice came from behind her. She turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the speaker without fully facing him. He stood taller than her, broad-shouldered, radiating the particular confidence that comes from knowing people will back you up. That maroon and white varsity jacket wasn't subtle, it didn't need to be. The jacket was a signal, a uniform that announced hierarchy and privilege. "Yes," she replied, keeping her tone calm and neutral. He smiled like he'd already won something she didn't know they were competing for. "You're new." "I noticed." Chuckles rippled through the group behind him. His friends maintained strategic positioning, close enough to participate, far enough to claim plausible deniability. "You don't talk much, do you?" he continued. "I'm here to eat." Under normal circumstances, that should have ended the exchange. In a healthier environment, it would have. But normal rules didn't apply in spaces where power functioned as currency and boredom transformed ordinary people into cruel ones. He stepped closer. Too close. She adjusted her weight instinctively, angling her body to maintain balance, keeping her tray level. Her eyes flicked toward the exits, not from fear, but assessment. She reminded herself not to overreact. She'd dealt with worse than arrogant teenagers in a school cafeteria. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated. Providing her name felt like surrendering leverage. "Yeah. And I don't share it with strangers." That's when his smile tightened, just fractionally. The moment when the joke stopped being amusing to him. "You think you're better than us?" he asked, raising his voice enough that nearby conversations dipped in volume. "No," she said evenly. "I think I'm busy." She attempted to step past him. That was the mistake. Not because her action was wrong, but because he wasn't accustomed to being bypassed. His arm shot out, blocking her path, his hand brushing against her tray. Milk sloshed dangerously close to the rim. "Watch it," he said, though he was the one who'd moved. Her pulse accelerated. Around them, the crowd sensed escalation. That invisible tightening, like everyone leaning forward without actually moving. "Move," she said quietly. He laughed. "You've got attitude. And you're standing in my way." For a split second, something flickered behind his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or irritation. She wasn't performing the role he'd assigned her. He leaned in, dropping his voice. "Careful. People don't like girls who forget their place." That word, *place*, landed heavier than the rest. Her jaw clenched. Unwanted memories stirred at the edges of her consciousness. Training grounds, locker rooms, all those moments when silence had been the safer option. She swallowed hard. "I know exactly where I am. And you're done." She tried again to move forward. This time, his hand didn't just block her path. "Before we continue, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Stories like this need to be heard, and your support means everything." Chapter 2, The Line Crossed. The contact was brief, almost casual in its execution. That casualness made it worse, the way he treated her body as just another object occupying space he controlled. Her back hit the pillar harder than she anticipated. The concrete felt cold even through fabric. Her tray clattered to the floor, the plastic echo sharp and loud, commanding every eye in the room simultaneously. Time performed that strange stretching phenomenon. Sounds sharpened while faces blurred at the edges of her vision. "Whoa," someone said, half laughing. "Relax," he said again, hands raised in mock innocence. She tripped. She didn't respond immediately. Her mind raced through options and consequences. Fight back and become labeled as the problem. Stay still and allow the behavior to continue. Her breathing went shallow, not from fear, but from anger she was fighting to contain. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. "Back up," she said firmly. He didn't comply. Instead, he leaned close enough that she could smell expensive cologne mixing with cafeteria grease. His voice dropped to a level meant only for her, though everyone watching understood what was happening. "You embarrassed me," he said quietly. "That's not smart." Her eyes darted across the crowd again, desperately searching. A girl at a nearby table looked down at her phone. A guy shifted uncomfortably in his seat but remained seated. Nobody stepped forward. The silence felt suffocating. She felt exposed in a way that transcended physical vulnerability. It was the public nature of the violation, the understanding that whatever happened next would define how people saw her here. New girl. Troublemaker. Victim. Fighter. Labels waiting to snap into place. "Let me go," she said, her voice firmer now. He smirked. "Or what?" That was the question, wasn't it? Or what, because he understood the unspoken rules as well as she did. He knew how quickly blame traveled, how easily narratives bent to favor certain people. He had witnesses. He had history. He had status. She had none of those advantages here. A flicker of movement caught her attention. That scraping chair again, louder this time. Somewhere beyond the crowd, a man stood up, older than the students, broader, dressed in civilian clothes rather than school attire. He didn't rush forward. He didn't shout. He simply watched with sharp eyes, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested control rather than passivity. She didn't know who he was. Not yet. But something in his stillness steadied her, just enough to hold on. The bully noticed too, glancing over his shoulder with annoyance. "What?" he snapped, then turned back to her, irritation creeping into his voice. "You think someone's coming to save you?" She met his gaze, chest rising and falling rapidly. "I think you should stop." The room held its collective breath. He laughed again, but the sound rang hollow this time. He leaned even closer, lowering his voice further. "You don't get to tell me what to do." In that moment, the power imbalance was absolute. Him standing with the crowd at his back, seemingly untouchable. Her pinned against concrete, isolated, every movement scrutinized. And yet, beneath the shock and humiliation, something else burned inside her. Resolve. The quiet kind that doesn't announce itself loudly. The kind that waits for the right moment. The man in the background took a step forward. Nobody noticed yet. But the moment had crossed a line, and lines once crossed demand answers. Chapter 3, The Intervention. The chair scraped again, unmistakable now. Not loud enough to dominate the room, but sharp enough to slice through the tension like a blade against whetstone. The sound carried intention, the kind that comes from someone who has already made a decision. The bully glanced back, irritation flashing across his handsome features, then returned his attention to her as if daring the interruption to matter. His hand still hovered close, not touching now, but near enough to remind her that he could if he chose to. That unspoken threat sat heavy in her chest. "Look at you," he said, voice low and smug. "Acting tough. You think people are scared of you?" She didn't answer. She focused on her breathing, slow, controlled, the way she'd been taught long before arriving at this school. Long before fluorescent lights and plastic trays. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Panic wased. Ed energy. Panic created mistakes. Behind him, the man took another deliberate step forward. He didn't fit this environment. That would be the first thing anyone noticed if they were paying attention. No backpack. No school colors. Plain dark shirt, worn boots. His posture was loose but not careless. Every movement economical, as if he'd learned long ago that unnecessary motion was a liability. He scanned the room quickly, noting exits, distances, reactions. Old habits never really died. He'd come in for a late lunch, nothing more complicated than that. Grab a sandwich, sit quietly, kill time before an appointment across town. He'd chosen a table near the wall out of instinct, back to something solid. He noticed things. He always had. At first, he'd registered the commotion as background noise. Teenagers posturing, voices rising. It happened everywhere, in every school, every day. But then he'd seen her face clearly. Not fear, exactly. Shock, yes. Anger held tightly in check. And something else beneath those surface emotions, discipline. The kind that didn't belong in a high school cafeteria. The kind you didn't learn from gym class or YouTube videos. The kind forged somewhere harsher. He'd watched long enough to understand this wasn't mutual. Power flowed one direction here, and it wasn't subtle. The bully shifted closer to her again, invading her space like it was a game with no consequences. Say something, he pressed. Or are you going to cry? That did it. Hey, the man said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it carried weight, cutting through the ambient noise. The room didn't go silent completely, but the sound level dipped noticeably, like a wave pulling back from shore. The bully turned fully this time, clear annoyance on his face. Mind your business. The man stepped into clearer view, stopping several feet away. He didn't square up aggressively. He didn't puff his chest. He simply stood there, eyes steady, voice even. I am minding my business, he said calmly. A few students shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't part of the script they were accustomed to. Adults usually came in loud and authoritative, or they didn't come in at all. This man did neither. The bully laughed, though it came out forced. She's fine. What are you, some kind of hero? The man glanced at her just once, not in a way that asked permission, but in I that acknowledged her presence, her agency. She met his eyes and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She wasn't asking to be saved. She was acknowledging an ally. That's not what this is, the man said, turning back to the bully. Step away from her. The bully scoffed. Or what? The question echoed through the space, heavier now. Or what? It was the same challenge he'd thrown at her, the same challenge he'd thrown at teachers and administrators and anyone else who'd ever tested him and ultimately backed down. He expected the same outcome here. The man exhaled slowly through his nose. Or you're going to learn something today you won't enjoy. There it was. Not a threat, a statement of fact. The bully's confident smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He recovered quickly, puffing up, drawing strength from his crowd. You touch me and I'll. You won't, the man interrupted calmly. Because if you were going to do something, you'd have done it already. That landed harder than any shout ever could. The room felt different now. Not safer yet, but altered, like gravity had shifted just enough to be noticeable. She slid a step sideways, no longer pinned against the column. Nobody stopped her. And for the first time since this began, the bully hesitated. Hesitation wasn't something the bully was familiar with experiencing. It felt wrong, uncomfortable, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet. His confidence had always been automatic, reflexive, fed by laughter and silence and the unspoken agreement that he could do what he wanted and walk away clean. That agreement was fraying now, right in front of him. You think you scare me, he snapped, though his voice had risen, betraying him. This isn't even your school. The man nodded once. I know that. The answer confused him. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't reactive. It was simply factual. And it made him uneasy in a way he didn't know how to articulate. Around them, the crowd had shifted from passive entertainment to something closer to uncertainty. Phones were still out, recording, but hands trembled slightly. People whispered to each other. This was unfamiliar territory, an adult who wasn't playing by the established rules. A situation that didn't resolve neatly. She stood several feet away now, rubbing her wrist where adrenaline still buzzed beneath the skin. Her heartbeat hadn't slowed, but her mind had sharpened considerably. She watched the man carefully, recognizing patterns in how he moved. The way he positioned himself between her and the bully without making a theatrical show of it. The way his weight stayed balanced, ready for anything. She'd seen that before. Not here, but somewhere else in her past. The bully took a step forward, then stopped when the man didn't move backward. Their proximity was close enough now that the differences between them became obvious. Not size necessarily, but presence. One was loud and performative. The other didn't. Need to be. You don't know who I am, the bully said, trying again to reclaim lost ground. I know exactly who you are, the man replied evenly. You're someone who thinks witnesses are protection. A murmur rippled through the assembled students. That observation hit a nerve because it named a truth everyone understood but never said aloud. The bully thrived on crowds, on shared guilt, on diffusion of responsibility. Touch her again, the man continued, his voice still level and controlled, and every set of eyes in here becomes a problem for you, not a shield. The bully glanced around nervously. Faces looked back at him now, not all amused anymore. Some curious. Some uneasy. Some already distancing themselves mentally, inching chairs back fractionally, silently signaling they didn't want to be part of this anymore. You can't do anything, he said, but it sounded hollow even to him. You don't even belong here. The man smiled slightly, not with humor but with recognition. I belong anywhere someone decides to hurt another person in public. That was the moment the full weight of the situation settled in. Not just for the bully, but for everyone watching. This wasn't about institutional rules or administrative authority or who had the loudest voice. It was about accountability, immediate and unavoidable. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, but validation. The quiet confirmation that what she'd experienced was real, that she wasn't overreacting or misunderstanding the situation. Someone else saw it too. Someone else recognized it for exactly what it was. A cafeteria monitor appeared at the edge of the room, drawn by the unusual tension. What's going on here? She asked, sounding uncertain and already overwhelmed. The bully opened his mouth, ready to spin his version of events. The man spoke first, his voice clear and precise. He blocked her path, pushed her against the pillar, and refused to let her leave. No embellishment. No emotional language. Just facts. The monitor blinked, looking at the spilled tray on the floor, the pillar, the space between bodies. Evidence she hadn't wanted to see but couldn't ignore now that it had been pointed out. Is that true? She asked the bully. He hesitated. Just a bit too long. The answer didn't matter anymore. The hesitation said everything. She stepped forward, finding her voice stronger now. I want to file a report. The bully spun toward her, eyes wide with something approaching panic. You can't. I can, she said steadily. And I am. The man took a step back, giving space now that it was no longer critically needed. His role in this moment was complete. Intervention wasn't about dominating a situation. It was about restoring balance so that others could act. As staff members began moving, as murmurs grew louder throughout the cafeteria, she met the man's eyes one more time. Gratitude flickered there, unspoken but unmistakable. He nodded once, subtle and understated. Then he turned away, already fading back into the background where he was most comfortable. But nothing in that room would return to how it was before. Because power had been challenged publicly and clearly. And once that happens, consequences must follow. The hallway outside the cafeteria felt colder than it should have, though the temperature hadn't actually changed. The same fluorescent lights followed her path, but here they hummed louder, harsher, as if they'd stopped pretending to be neutral observers. She walked beside the cafeteria monitor, her steps steady despite the fact that her legs still carried the echo of adrenaline. Behind them, the bully trailed between two administrators, his shoulders tense, his jaw clenched visibly. The crowd they'd left behind buzzed like a disturbed hive, speculation already spreading faster than truth ever could. She kept her eyes forward. That was among the first lessons she'd learned years ago, long before this building, long before this town. When pressure comes, you don't look back for approval. You don't scan faces for comfort or validation. You keep moving, one step at a time, because momentum provides its own protection. Inside the small administrative office, the air hung stale and heavy with the smell of old paper and burnt coffee. A desk lamp cast a yellow pool of light that felt too intimate for what was about to be discussed. The monitor gestured for her to sit. She did, hands folded loosely in her lap, posture upright and controlled. Calm wasn't weakness. Calm was control. "Tell us what happened," one of the administrators said, already opening a folder to begin documentation. She spoke clearly and precisely. No dramatics, no exaggeration. She described the blocked path, the unwanted physical contact, the refusal to allow her to leave. She named the feelings without letting those feelings swallow her testimony. That required effort. It always did. But she understood something many people didn't: emotional clarity carried more weight than emotional volume. As she spoke, the bully shifted in his chair, scoffing softly, shaking his head as if bored by the entire proceeding. It was a performance, one that had worked for him many times before. "That's not how I went," he cut in dismissively. She was being rude. "I was joking around. Everyone saw it." The administrator raised a hand firmly. "You'll have your turn to speak." He leaned back, arms crossed defensively, trying to reclaim space and control. But the room wasn't a cafeteria. There was no crowd to hide within here. No laughter to cushion him or dilute responsibility. "And when I asked him to move," she continued steadily, "he escalated the situation. He used his body to prevent me from leaving." Silence settled over the small office like a physical weight. The administrator looked at a tablet, pulling up a photo of the spilled tray that someone had already snapped and forwarded to staff. Evidence had a way of stripping stories down to their essential bones. "We have multiple witnesses," the administrator said carefully, "and several corroborate your account exactly." The bully's head snapped up. "Who?" "That's not relevant right now." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear yet, but calculation. He was realizing this situation wasn't ending the way things usually ended for him. Outside the office, through the narrow window in the door, she saw the man again, the one who had stepped in. He stood with his arms relaxed at his sides, speaking quietly with another staff member. He didn't look anxious or triumphant. He looked resolved, like someone who had done this kind of thing before and knew exactly when to step forward and when to step back. The administrator followed her gaze briefly, then returned to his notes. "We're taking this seriously," he said firmly. "You did the right thing by reporting what happened." Those words landed heavier than she'd expected. Not because she needed reassurance about her actions, but because so few people ever actually said them out loud. The bully snorted derisively. "This is ridiculous." The administrator looked at him with sharp disapproval. "What's ridiculous is your behavior." The sentence hung in the air, undeniable and final. She felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not victory exactly, but something quieter and more solid. Validation mixed with exhaustion. Standing up always cost energy. It always had. But it remained worth the price. As the meeting wrapped up, the administrator outlined next steps with bureaucratic precision. Formal investigation. Temporary suspension from extracurricular activities. Mandatory review of conduct policies. Consequences that would ripple far beyond this small O. Fice. The bully's bravado cracked, just slightly. This is going to ruin my record. The administrator didn't soften his expression. That's something you should have considered earlier. She stood when dismissed, smoothing her shirt, grounding herself in the physical motion and sensation. As she reached the door, the man caught her eye again through the window. This time, he gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not pride exactly. Recognition. Acknowledgement. Outside, the hallway felt different despite being identical physically. Same lights, same walls, same institutional beige. But she walked taller now. Not because she'd won some victory, but because she hadn't folded under pressure. And sometimes, in places like this, that mattered more than winning ever could. Chapter 6, Ripples. News traveled with remarkable speed through the school's social networks. By the end of that first day, multiple versions of the story had already mutated and evolved, stretched and bent to fit whoever was telling it. Some claimed she'd overreacted dramatically. Others insisted the bully had finally pushed too far and gotten what he deserved. A few exaggerated the intervention itself, transforming the man into something larger than life. Because people preferred their heroes clean and dramatic, uncomplicated by nuance. She ignored the narratives as much as possible. That night, alone in her small apartment, she sat on the edge of her bed staring at the blank wall long after the sun had disappeared below the horizon. The silence pressed in around her, heavier than the crowded cafeteria had ever been. This was the part nobody filmed or shared online. The aftermath. The questions that crept in when adrenaline finally faded and left you alone with yourself. Had she handled everything correctly? Would the situation get worse before it improved? Would this incident define her entire experience here, whether she wanted it to or not? She closed her eyes and focused on breathing. Across town, the man sat at his own kitchen table, a half-eaten meal cooling slowly in front of him. He replayed the cafeteria scene in his head, not because he doubted his actions, but because reflection was deeply ingrained habit. Years of military service had wired him that way. After-action reviews, they'd called them. What went right? What went wrong? What could be improved next time? He knew he'd crossed an invisible line today. Not legally. Not morally. But socially. Intervening in public situations always carried risks, escalation, misinterpretation, potential retaliation. He'd assessed the situation in seconds and stepped in anyway, because some moments didn't wait for perfect conditions or complete information. The next morning, the cafeteria felt like different territory entirely. People glanced at her openly now, no longer pretending not to notice her presence. Some nodded in what seemed like respect. Some avoided eye contact entirely. A few offered quiet words of support, awkward but apparently sincere. One girl muttered, "That was brave," as she passed in the lunch line. Brave? She wasn't entirely sure about that characterization. She'd been angry. She'd been cornered. She'd acted based on instinct and training. The bully wasn't there, conspicuous in his absence. His usual table sat partially empty. The chairs where he typically held court remained unoccupied. The space felt lighter somehow, not safe yet, but less oppressive. She spotted the man near the back of the cafeteria again, eating quietly by himself. He caught her eye and gestured subtly toward an empty chair across from him, an invitation without any pressure attached. She hesitated only a moment before joining him. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded in acknowledgement. "You handled yourself well. That situation could have gone very badly." "It could have," she agreed quietly. "But it didn't," he said, "because you didn't back down when it mattered." She studied him then, really looked, taking in the calm awareness, the controlled movements, the invisible scars he carried but didn't discuss. "You're military?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Something like that." They ate in companionable silence for several moments, the ambient noise of the cafeteria flowing around them like water around stones. Finally, he spoke again. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "most people don't step in during situations like that because they're afraid of becoming part of the story themselves." She considered that observation carefully. "And most bullies count on exactly that fear." He met her gaze directly. "Exactly." The conversation didn't last much longer. It didn't need to. Some connections weren't meant to linger indefinitely. They existed to reinforce something important in a specific moment, then fade naturally. As she stood to leave, she felt steadier than she had in weeks. The system hadn't magically fixed itself overnight. People hadn't suddenly become universally kinder or more aware. But a line had been drawn, publicly and clearly. And for the first time since arriving at this school, she believed something fundamental, that her presence here didn't require anyone else's permission. That belief changed everything. Chapter 7, The Shift. By the third day after the incident, the story had stopped being primarily about what happened and started being about what it meant. That shift in focus mattered more than anyone initially realized. In hallways and classrooms, conversations lowered in volume when she passed, not out of fear, but out of a new awareness. People were recalibrating their internal compasses. They were asking themselves quiet questions they'd avoided before. What would I have done? Why didn't I do anything? Would I step in next time, or would I keep my head down like always? Those questions had weight. And weight changes behavior over time. She felt the change most acutely in small moments. A chair pulled out for her without ceremony or comment. A classmate asking her opinion during discussion and actually listening to her answer. These weren't grand gestures or dramatic transformations. They were adjustments, subtle, human ones. The kind that happen when a system gets nudged off autopilot and people start thinking more consciously about their choices. But not everyone adjusted in healthy or productive ways. By the end of the week, she started noticing different looks, the ones that weren't supportive or neutral, but resentful. The kind that said, "You disrupted something comfortable. Not comfortable for you, but comfortable for us." Those looks came mostly from people who had benefited from the old order of silence. People who'd laughed at the bully's jokes before. People who'd filmed incidents instead of intervening. She understood them better than they understood themselves. Change always exposed those who had thrived under previous conditions. One afternoon, she sat alone in the gym after a workout, stretching methodically. Physical exertion remained her anchor in uncertain times. Muscles didn't lie or manipulate. They responded to effort honestly, without politics or social maneuvering. Sweat grounded her in ways conversation never could. As she reached for her water bottle, her phone buzzed insistently. A notification, then another. Screenshots forwarded from someone she barely knew, snapshots of a group chat thread. Not subtle. Not private enough to stay hidden. She played the victim. Dude was just joking. Now we have to watch everything we say, Her thumb hovered over the screen. The familiar pull rose inside her, the urge to defend herself, to explain, to justify her actions and correct the narrative. She resisted that impulse. Not because she was weak or afraid, but because she was learning something deeper and more important. Not every accusation deserved a response. Not every false narrative could be corrected through argument. And not every silence was surrender. Across town, the man sat in his truck parked outside a hardware store, engine off, windows down slightly to let in cool air. He hadn't meant to encounter this particular situation. Hadn't planned to stay in the area this long. But he'd delayed his departure more than once this week, for reasons that irritated him enough to force genuine reflection. He'd spent years in environments where bullying took different shapes, rank-based power, unspoken rules enforced through systematic humiliation rather than physical violence. He'd witnessed what happened when good people stayed quiet out of fear or social pressure. He'd lived with the outcomes of moments when someone should have stepped in and didn't. That was why the cafeteria scene hadn't felt optional to him. He'd seen the pattern clearly and acted on recognition. But what lingered now wasn't the confrontation itself. It was the aftershock. The way systems and social structures resisted correction. The way individuals bore the cost of collective cowardice. He wondered how she was holding up under that pressure. The answer came sooner than he expected. The following morning, he watched from a comfortable distance as she walked into the school building. Her posture remained the same, upright, composed, controlled. But something about her eyes had hardened noticeably. Not in a bitter way. In a focused way. She wasn't just surviving this experience anymore. She was processing it actively. And processing led inevitably to decisions. By lunchtime, a rumor reached her through multiple channels that the bully's suspension had been extended pending further review. That his coach had benched him indefinitely from the team. That college scouts who'd been interested were suddenly reconsidering based on character concerns. The rumor wasn't entirely accurate in all its details, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was the fundamental shift it represented. Consequences were no longer merely theoretical or abstract. That afternoon, she was called into another meeting. This time, not about the incident itself, but about what came next institutionally. Restorative justice practices. Policy reviews. Assemblies about conduct and bystander responsibility. The institution attempting to retrofit ethics after the fact, to close the barn door after the horses had already ped. As she,